Hello? Hello?
Podcast Network Asia.
Welcome to She Talks Peace, a podcast that highlights the role of women peacebuilders around the world in bringing lasting peace and security to communities. Eavesdrop on their communities and get to know their stories. From the Philippines to Malaysia, from Indonesia to Palestine, from Myanmar to the United States. Their dreams and hopes for a world without violence and a world where every woman and girl can be whoever she wants to be. Hosted by Amina Bernardo, President of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. This is She Talks Peace.
It's not as if governments have not negotiated with so-called terrorists, right? Because most of the peace negotiations, we talk about the negotiations with the Irish Republican Army, the Communist Party of Nepal, or even the GAM in Aceh at the time, they were all labeled terrorists. But in the end, the conflict was settled precisely through peaceful negotiations.
Salam, everyone. Hello. Welcome to another episode of She Talks Peace. This is Amina of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy, joining you from Manila. My partner and co-host, Ayesa Abubakar, unfortunately can't join us today, and I hope she's doing well in Sabah. Do you know that while the West celebrates the film industry with the Oscars, and you've got the Emmys and the BAFTA awards, here in the Philippines, in Manila, we actually have our own. It's the Metro Manila Film Festival. And this last festival ran from December 25 to January 7. Now, during the festival, only Filipino entries, Filipino movies are shown in our theaters. And this year, there was one interesting entry. The title of that movie was Mamasapano, Now It Can Be Told. It's a film about a clash between government, the police, special action force, and elements of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in 2015. The SAF, the Special Action Force, were hunting and trying to capture a foreign terrorist named Zulkifli Abdir, alias Marwan. But this encounter turned out really badly and led to the death of 44 members of the police. And they were the Special Action Force. And from then on, they have been referred to as the SAF 44, the Mamasapano tragedy, rocked the nation and almost derailed the passage of the law, which would have implemented the major part of the peace agreement between our government, the Philippine government, and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or the MILF. And that law was to establish the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. Immediately after that clash, the MILF was accused of ambushing the SAF 44 and protecting a foreign terrorist. Those days were, to put it mildly, not good for those of us who have been rooting for, lobbying for, or for the peace process to be successful in Muslim Mindanao. Our guest today, my dear listeners, was the chair of the government panel negotiating with the MILF, and I am so sure that she probably has vivid recollections of those days after Mamasapano. Well, luckily, cooler heads eventually prevailed, and the law was passed. And today, we have the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. My dear friends and listeners, our guest for today is Miriam Coronel-Ferrer, or Iye, as we call her. Iye chaired the government panel, which successfully signed the peace agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. When she left the peace process, she became a member of the United Nations standby team of senior mediators, providing support to UN missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Maldives, Kosovo, among others. In 2020, she co-founded the Southeast Asian Women Network of Peace Mediators and Negotiators. These days, Iye sits on the board of advisors of the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders and is a senior mediation advisor at the UN. Welcome to She Talks Peace, Iye.
Hi, Amina, and I'm very happy to be here with you in your program.
It's so good of you to join us. And for those who can see Iye, she's sitting in her study up in the mountains of Rizal in a beautiful place called Tanay. Oh, so it's such an enviable thing watching you, Iye. Anyway.
Yeah, I've moved here since the pandemic. It's a perfect place to, pass by the period where we all had to isolate ourselves. So very close to nature and eating fresh fruits and just breathing fresh air every day.
I was just thinking, it's been years since you've been in government. But the first time I met you, you were a professor of political science at the University of the Philippines. How did you get into peace negotiations and mediation, Iye?
Well, I was always one foot in the university and the other foot in civil society. Remember that since 1986, we have been campaigning for peace processes with the different armed groups in our country. Of course, the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army, is still ongoing. The conflict with them is still ongoing, so it's been very difficult really to find a resolution there. But we've had more successes, as you can see, with the Moro National Liberation Front, with the final peace agreement during the time of President Ramos in 1996, and then with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in 2014, and during the tenure of President Simeon Benigno Aquino III. And there were the smaller groups, of course, with the Cordillera People's Liberation Army, the factions within the Communist Party, the smaller factions there. But in any case, all this time we have been pushing for that kind of a policy approach, a policy that prioritizes the peace process over a military strategy. So it was both as an academic and also as a peace advocate that I was put in a position to be considered to be part of a negotiating team, this time with government and vis-a-vis the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. I did some work as part of the technical working group with the talks with the CPP NPA before, but yeah, that didn't really go very far.
If it's not breaking any government confidence, Iye, can you tell us some of the interesting moments were you the first woman to be chair of the negotiating panel? What it was like negotiating with the MILF and later on dealing with the Communist Party, NPA groups. Did they welcome you immediately? Yeah.
Many times there have been other women in the government team, right? And the MILF has always been all men throughout the 17 years of negotiations. But every now and then you've had two, even up to two women. In our case, we had at most, by the time we ended, we had 3 women in our team. So it wasn't really new that there were women in the team, but what really sort of like something new for them was to have a woman to chair the negotiations. And in the beginning, as we can see, there was some resistance to the idea. But I think we have to credit them that along the way they got used to it.
I remember when we were helping the Office of the Peace Advisor by lobbying quietly for gender advocacy to come in, that the chair of the MILF panel used to be really stiff and really resistant, but I guess women wore him down. And the MILF panel finally saw you can't beat them, join them. Is that it? Or did they really see the value that women brought to the negotiating table?
Mohagger Iqbal, who chaired the Moro Islamic Liberation Front panel, said that they've negotiated with ambassadors, generals, secretaries, cabinet secretaries, and so on. But the woman was the toughest. So he said, and I guess it's also because we were dealing now with all the nitty-gritty of the negotiations. Everything had to be agreed on. Talking about powers, for example, there's just a whole range of governance powers from, transportation, communication, natural resources, and so on, and all of these other areas of governance. So, when you get into these details, and that's why he also said that the women are more focused on the details, and that's because we were discussing details, which we thought was very important to get done, because otherwise, we realized that in the past, one of the lessons we learned from the experience with the MNLF talks is that many of these details were not sorted out, including details on the disarmament, the question of what to do with the weapons and the combatants, and also the follow-up, how you settle disputes, because implementation is certainly just as difficult as the negotiation. Every step of the way, there's potential for tensions to come in. There's potential for violence to happen, like what you started out with, the story of Mamasapano that happened about 9 months after we signed the agreement. So this violence still continue to happen if you don't have a good mechanism precisely to address all of this. And it's very good that we have a very functional ceasefire committee, all these other contingents that we have put in place, even that come in the way of dispute resolution, then you're able to settle these problems.
Going back to the Mamasapano encounter, after the clash, senators, congressmen went into a frenzy, criticizing the peace talks with the MILF, saying, why are we negotiating with terrorists? I remember then Senator Alan Peter Cayetano saying, all governments around the world have a policy of not negotiating with terrorists. In fact, saying that the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was a terrorist organization. How did you manage to push for the support of the peace process? Must have been so difficult, Iye.
It was. But maybe just to have a broader framework, it's not as if governments have not negotiated with so-called terrorists, right?
Yeah.
Because most of the peace negotiations, we talk about the negotiations with the Irish Republican Army, the Communist Party of Nepal, or even the GAM in Aceh at the time, they were all labeled terrorists. But in the end, the conflict was settled precisely through peaceful negotiations. And in these places now, you don't have these conflicts anymore. So, and most of the senators and other legislators in the lower house who were very, very critical, did this sudden turnaround because of public opinion, the sentiment because of so many police officers who were killed on that day, on that fateful day. They were all invited and they came to the signing ceremonies, both of the framework agreement and the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. So it was a turnaround that because of the shift in public opinion that was so grossly, that put into question we understand the sentiment at the time. Why are people with whom we have signed an agreement killing our police force? I think that was a very valid sentiment, but the whole context had to be really understood, and it's a very complicated context because of the peculiarity of the area and some of the procedures that are actually in place. So for us during that time, part of our effort was to explain how the ceasefire agreement worked and why the ceasefire protocols were actually not observed by the police,
Right.
especially by General Napeñas, who was the one in charge of the operation at the time, operationally, So he did not coordinated with the military, which meant
Right.
the military was not aware that there was going to be an operation, and therefore all the needed preparation, even for the rescue that had to be done afterwards, was not there. I mean, the helicopters were not available to
Yeah.
pull out the team that actually managed, the smaller team that actually managed to kill Manwar, which was in a different area altogether. So what we were trying to explain to them, that kind of a context where there were ceasefire protocols that, if they were observed, that kind of a misencounter would not have happened. But there were other things that we did try to do to be able to get, to recover some of the the public support on the process. One was, of course, to convince Mr. Iqbal to appear at the Senate
Right.
hearing,
That's right.
give
Yeah.
a face to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, because many people in Congress have not seen any MILF member,
Right.
right? Even though some of them did see them during the signing ceremony, but have not really engaged them, and to see and for them to speak up as well in their behalf. So it is not as if that we were defending them; we were defending the process, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
they would have to speak up for themselves. So he did that, although he was very resistant to the idea, saying that we are still a revolutionary force. The
Right.
agreement has not
He could
been
get arrested.
and that's true because they were forcing him to give his real name at that time, which
Right.
endangered the security of his family. The second part was this very difficult operation to retrieve the weapons of the SAP that were seized during
Yeah,
the fighting.
that's
By the
behind.
way, it was not only the Moro Islamic Liberation Front that joined the fray, because in this community, especially Mamasapano, you have different armed groups,
Yeah,
including violent extremist groups.
that's right.
So if you do not distinguish these different groups, you will get nowhere. You will drive them all towards extremism. And the MILF is a moderate Islamic group.
Mhm.
And now you had that disagreement. But just imagine what it was for the people in the community waking up early morning, one of them crossing this wooden bridge and seeing so many very heavily armed police officers crossing the waters onto the bridge, and then one of them being shot. Actually, it was the gunshot. One civilian being shot. It was the gunshot that woke up the whole community because they were awake anyway at 4 a.m. to
Yeah,
get ready for
for the
prayers.
prayers. Yeah, for the prayers.
Right. So that was the unfortunate incident that happened, and everybody just went out and they thought they were being attacked. And the impulse of a community that has been at war for more than 50 years was precisely to defend themselves against the outsider. But that was not easy to be understood by the general public. But in any case, what many of the weapons of the special action forces were taken, like war booty, right? And we had to we told the MLF, show goodwill by retrieving the weapons and returning it to the special action forces. So myself and my panel member at the time, Senen Bakani, actually stationed ourselves at the military camp in Maguindanao for several days, making sure that that operation of retrieval, in coordination with the ceasefire committee of the members of the ceasefire committee of the MILF and our ceasefire committee and our armies, to be able to get back most of these weapons that they were able to seize and return them. For the first time you have this event happening, an armed group returning the weapons to the police.
Yeah, I hate to be a sexist uh, about this, but I can't help but feel that if it had been a macho man at the head of the government panel, the MILF might not have agreed to turning over the firearms. When you're doing your mediation activities for the UN in Kosovo and in other places, do you see that being a woman makes a difference? Do we really add value here?
Well, we do have perspectives that others socialize differently, like the male gender will not be able to see. Like for example, I did some work in one island in one in South Asia. One work in South Asia where there was a political crisis, and we had to meet with the different political parties. And of course, they were all male dominated political parties. And what was very interesting, in fact, was that the Islamic Party was the only one that had a woman coming into our meetings, right?
That's interesting.
So that's very interesting. The rest were secular parties, but it's an Islamic, a Muslim dominated country in any case. So that kind of rapport that you establish with this with other women, or even some of the men who may not react as well for tough questions that you are asking, right? If a man was asking them even more aggressively. So I think in a way they feel that to a certain extent they may be more restrained to be more aggressive if they're dealing with a woman. And in fact, that was the fear of Mr. Iqbal, that if a woman will chair the negotiations, then they will find it difficult, because he said, in fact, they don't quarrel with a woman. Uh, which was, as we know, is not necessarily true, right? But what they was saying was that it will be very hard to be as aggressive as when they were talking with another man, right? So it does change some of the behavior. So I really think if you have a room and there are women in there, the men will behave differently in both positive and negative sense.
What negative can you say?
Well, the
If
negative,
a woman is in the room.
there could be a lot of sexist jokes. That's negative.
Yes.
Green
Yes.
jokes even,
Yes.
what we call green jokes. But in any case, on the other hand, it might actually make them behave better.
Yes.
Or maybe not real, or maybe when women start looking at the details, when women wanted more clarity, I think I don't know. It's not because we were born that way, but because we were socialized that way. That when we implement, we need all of this information in, right.
Right.
And when usually at the high level, they might want to avoid some of this the details, because it might create tension. But I think if a woman will be pushing for some of these details, the tension will be more regulated. It can be more managed more effectively, because precisely the aggression is cut down. Or maybe the pride issue might not be as as affected. The ego might not be as affected. But we cannot really generalize. I think it can be that some men are very, very good at diplomacy and mediation. Certainly, in fact, we have had a lot of successful mediation processes that were led by men. But I think in another, women can do it as well. I think that's the whole point. And the point is, we have not been given the chance.
Right.
These opportunities have not actually been open to us for the longest time.
As a negotiator and your years of experience in the peace process, looking at the war raging between Russia and Ukraine, do you think there could really ever be a workable peace process between these two countries?
I don't think that a simple meeting around the table will be able to do that. There has to be, although in the end, like they say, all wars end at the negotiating table. But before that could actually happen, there should be other factors. I mean, it's just the same question with Myanmar, where you have a
Right.
military junta
That's right.
that is just so just breaking all the rules of humanitarian law in fighting the resistance coming from its own citizenry. And on that point, it is very, very hard to at the current level of the engagement, the conflict. It is very, very hard, really, to sit down and think about how to find compromises that will bring about still some kind of coexistence with the military, or an arrangement. This is the case of Myanmar, an arrangement where the military will still continue to hold power, precisely because they have seen that and they've seen what has happened in the past. In Ukraine and Russia, some of the possible compromises might be with regard to some of the territories that have already been seized. But I am not sure if Ukraine is willing to concede that.
Yeah, they're unwilling.
Yes. So, but it doesn't mean that no mediation is going on. In fact, mediation is going on every day, both in Myanmar and on the Ukraine issue. There are a lot of interlocutors who are finding ways and means to make sense out of make people see sense
Right.
as to how it could possibly end.
Dear listeners, Ging Deles used to be the presidential advisor on the peace process during the administration of the late President Aquino, Noynoy Aquino. And Ging Deles and I, we are part of the ASEAN Women for Peace registry. We were happy that ASEAN finally approved and launched a regional plan of action on women, peace, and security. But as you very well know, Iye, it's a piece of paper unless governments really say, okay, we'll implement it. So Philippines has been implementing it for the last 16 or more years. Indonesia has finally come up with its own national plan so they can implement it. What do you think are the possible strategies so that we can have the other 8 countries of ASEAN seriously consider having implementing plans for women, peace, and security?
Well, I think the push has to come from both below and above. Just like our rice cake, the bibingka, right?
Right.
you hit it from below and you hit it from the top. So there's already a regional action plan on 1325 just recently launched. And the big question now is, what are the member countries going to do about it? So there should be that push, and I know that you're involved in that, Amina, as well, in that effort to produce a a regional action plan for the ASEAN, and that push should come from all these mechanisms at that level. But it's not going to happen unless there's also that push from below, coming from their respective civil society or the civil society networks that now exist within the region, because that has been one of the important trend over the last 20 years, when we saw um, region-wide, ASEAN-wide civil society networks really playing even more and more significant roles beyond the basically track two network at the time. But now you have all of these grassroots based or still track two based networks, but are more integrated with communities and grassroots organizing. So you have all of these different uh, possible sources of pressure to bring on board the National Action Plan, to see the light of National Action Plans across in the rest of the ASEAN. In fact, Indonesia did follow suit quite
Yeah,
because they're now in their second or even
that's
third
right. Yeah.
National Action Plan. Thailand says that they have is not framed as a national action plan, but they do have different different programs. But it's still different to have all these different programs until you bring them together within that kind of a tighter peace and security framework, and not just at the very social level of domestic violence, etc. I think what the 1325 um, does emphasize is that kind of women's inclusion on peace and security issues, right? So
Yeah.
it's no longer just so-called soft issues having to do with maternal care, which are all
Violence
very
against women. Yeah.
violence against women, but these big political questions and women's participation and protection when it comes to these big political issues. So it's still different to frame a national action plan within the rubric of 1325 from all these different women's programs that they already have in different degrees across the different ASEAN countries.
Yeah. Coming back to the Philippines, now we have a new administration. You have Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as president. The presidential advisor on peace is now the Secretary of National Defense. What do you think the office of the presidential advisor should be doing so that it can increase the presence, the participation of women? Because a part of 1325 is making sure encouraging the participation of women.
Well, I think it might be useful to engage the leadership of the DND slash OPAP, precisely to be more conscious of mainstreaming gender in all its programs. In OPAP, at least you have people who have been there for a long time, so do engage the leadership on this question, so that the consciousness develops.
It's a
And
very,
it
very
becomes natural.
valuable suggestion. Yeah. Time flies when you're having fun. But before we end our conversation, Iye, maybe you have a message that you want to give to our listeners.
One, of course, has to do with being a peace advocate. I think it's a peace advocate is someone who really believes in active nonviolence, who believe that war is a choice, and therefore we should not continue to choose war or heavy-handed means to be able to settle our conflicts, but ensure that our commitment to human rights is always strong, because our human rights are the biggest foundation of peace for especially in our country, where we continue to have a lot of problems, both economic and political. So for them, wherever you are, you can be a peace advocate, especially for our young women. But it's very important also to have that kind of a collectivity. So do join groups or form your own groups to become involved, to be engaged, because there's strength in numbers. It's one thing to be conscious. It's another thing to be taking action together with others and really getting your messages across. But on the peace process front, maybe now to go to a different concern, and of course our concern now is implementing the peace agreement, which has been a very long process, just as long as the negotiations. It took us very long to pass the law, 4 years since we signed the agreement, and now we're still in a transition phase. There's of course going to be the crucial first election in the Bangsamoro in 2025. I think what we tried to do during the negotiation is to have a very inclusive process, not only in terms of who participates. Of course, we were not perfect. It was not 100% as it should be. But also what we tried was to have an outcome that is inclusive, not only in terms of gender, inclusive in terms of the different ethnic communities, Moro and non-Moro indigenous communities, inclusive in terms of all the different sectors in the Bangsamoro society. So what our message now, I think my message now is really to make sure that inclusivity continues to be sustained through different programs and policies that the Bangsamoro leadership can now can certainly have the power to do, right?
Right.
They have the power to do it because they are in power. And also government, because government is one half of the equation. They're the partner, the key partner at the highest level.
Thank you so much for that. It's not just a message, but it sounds to me that these are policy directions that if our government in the Philippines and other governments in Southeast Asia would pay attention to, could really help us in addressing armed conflicts where we find them, whether in the Philippines or Myanmar or Southern Thailand or any other place. So thank you so much, dear listeners. I hope you enjoyed our talk with Iye Coronel-Ferrer today. And this is Amina Rasul from the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy saying bye for now from Manila, and hope to see you again next week. Bye.
She Talks Peace is brought to you in partnership with Podcast Network Asia and Podmetrics, the easiest way to monetize your podcast. For more information, check out their website at podcastnetwork.asia and podmetrics.co.
The views and opinions expressed by the podcast creators, hosts, and guests do not necessarily reflect the official policy and position of Podcast Network Asia, the hosts of the program, or other programs of the network. Any content provided by the people on the podcast are of their own opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything.